You had a plan. You knew where you were going. You mapped it out step by step. You prayed about it, worked for it, believed in it, and then something happened. Something you didn't see coming. Something that threw everything off track. And now you're standing in the middle of confusion, wondering if what you're going through is part of the plan, because it sure doesn't feel like it. It feels like everything is working against you. It feels like you're stuck in a place you don't belong. It feels like God has gone silent while you're screaming for answers. But I came to tell you today, just because it doesn't feel like the plan doesn't mean it's not part of the plan. Think about Joseph. God gave him a dream, a vision of something great, but the moment he started walking toward it, life hit him with a detour. His own brothers threw him into a pit, sold him into slavery, betrayed him. He went from being the favorite son to a forgotten prisoner. And I bet if you had asked Joseph in that moment, when he was locked up, when he was accused of things he didn't do, when he felt abandoned, he probably would have said, "This doesn't look like the plan." But what Joseph couldn't see in the prison, God had already established in the palace. What looked like a setback was actually a set. What looked like rejection was really redirection. So what if what you're going through isn't proof that you're off track? What if it's evidence that God is moving in ways you don't understand yet? You've been crying over what you lost, but what if God removed it because it was never meant to go with you where He's taking you? You've been frustrated because doors are closing, but what if God is protecting you from walking into something that could destroy you? You have to shift your perspective. Stop asking, why is this happening to me? And start asking God, what are you doing through me? Because the moment you start seeing your struggle as part of the strategy, you'll stop fighting battles that are already won. Some of you have been trying to force things back into place. You've been trying to make something work that God has already removed. And the reason it's so hard, the reason you're exhausted, the reason you're frustrated, it's because you're fighting for something that's not even in the plan anymore. God is saying, let it go. Stop praying for the past to come back. Stop trying to fix what He's already replaced. The season you're in may not look like what you expected, but that doesn't mean it's not necessary. That doesn't mean it's not preparing you. Think about Jesus. He told His disciples, I have to suffer. I have to be rejected. I have to go through this. And Peter, bless his heart, said, no, Lord, that's not the plan. But Jesus looked at him and said, get behind me, Satan. Because Peter was trying to protect Jesus from the very thing that was necessary for his purpose. What if the thing you're trying to pray away is the very thing God is using to position you? What if the thing you're fighting against is the thing He's using to make you stronger? What if the storm isn't here to break you, but to build you? Sometimes the hardest part about faith isn't believing that God can do it. It's believing that what He's doing right now, even the painful parts, are still part of the plan. You might not see it yet, but if you could just hold on, if you could just keep trusting, if you could just keep moving forward, you would see that the thing you thought was a mistake was actually a miracle in the making. God doesn't make mistakes. So if He allowed it, He's going to use it. If He let you walk through it, He's going to bring something out of it. And when you get to the other side, when you see what He was doing all along, you'll look back and realize this was always part of the plan. Just because your situation doesn't match your expectations doesn't mean God isn't working. What seems like a setback is often a setup for something greater. Joseph went through betrayal, slavery, and prison, yet every hardship was part of God's strategy to position him for purpose. Your struggles are not wasted. Sometimes we fight to restore things God has already taken away. Trust that if he allowed something to leave, he has something better ahead. Real faith isn't just believing in miracles, but also trusting that even painful moments serve a divine purpose. The storm isn't there to break you, but to build you. What looks like chaos now will make sense later. God doesn't make mistakes. If he allowed it, he will use it for his glory and your good. You had it all mapped out. You knew how things were supposed to go. You planned, you prayed, you worked hard, and then out of nowhere, life took a turn you didn't expect. Suddenly, what was supposed to be a straight path turned into a detour. And now you're questioning everything. You're wondering if you made a mistake. You're wondering if you heard God wrong. You're wondering why things aren't happening the way you thought they would. But what if I told you that the detour isn't proof that you're off track? What if I told you that the thing that feels like an obstacle is actually an opportunity? What if I told you that just because your plan changed doesn't mean God's promise did? Look at Joseph. He had a dream. God showed him a vision of something great, and he believed it. But the moment he started moving toward it, life threw him into a pit, literally. His own brothers betrayed him. The very people who should have supported him were the ones who tried to destroy him. That wasn't part of his plan. Then, as if that wasn't enough, he was sold into slavery. He found himself in a foreign land, working for people he didn't know, serving in a place he never expected to be. He could have given up right there. He could have decided that his dream was over. But God was still with him, even in the detour, even in the place that seemed so far from the promise. God's hand was still on him. Then just when things started to look better, life hit him again. He was falsely accused, thrown into prison, forgotten by the very people he helped. Another setback, another detour. And I bet there were moments when Joseph sat in that prison cell wondering, was that dream even real? Did I just imagine it? Did I get it all wrong? Because that's what happens when life doesn't go the way we expect. We start doubting what we once believed so strongly. But here's what I need you to see. Just because it doesn't look like the plan doesn't mean it's not part of the plan. Joseph's detours weren't detours at all. They were divine directions. Every place he ended up, every unexpected turn was positioning him for the palace. If he had never been thrown into the pit, he would have never ended up in Egypt. If he had never been falsely accused, he would have never been in the prison where he met the person who would eventually introduce him to Pharaoh. And if he had never met Pharaoh, he would have never stepped into his purpose. What looked like a delay was actually divine alignment. What if the thing you're calling a setback is actually the thing setting you up for what God has next? What if the rejection was really protected? What if the closed door was actually leading you to the right one? Some of the greatest blessings come disguised as disappointments. Some of the most powerful breakthroughs come wrapped in what feels like brokenness. Think about the children of Israel. God promised them a land flowing with milk and honey. But instead of taking them straight there, he led them the long way around. He took them through the wilderness, through dry places, through difficulties, and they complained. They thought God had abandoned them. But what they didn't realize was that God was preparing them. If he had taken them straight into the promise, they wouldn't have been ready for it. They would have crumbled under the weight of what he wanted to give them. The detour was actually his mercy. Maybe the reason you're not where you thought you'd be yet isn't because God is saying no. Maybe he's saying not yet. Maybe he's strengthening you. Maybe he's shaping your character. Maybe he's teaching you how to handle the weight of what you're praying for. Because it's one thing to receive a blessing. It's another thing to be ready for it. So don't despise the detour. Don't let frustration make you forfeit your faith. Just because it doesn't look like what you expected doesn't mean it's not leading you exactly where you need to be. You thought you knew how this was going to go. You thought you had it all figured out. You saw the vision, you felt the calling, and you started moving toward it with confidence. But now, you're standing in a place that looks nothing like what you expected. Instead of open doors, you're facing roadblocks. Instead of clarity, you're dealing with confusion. Instead of progress, you feel like you're moving backward. And the question that keeps running through your mind is this really part of the plan? Because if God had a plan for you, shouldn't it be easier than this? Shouldn't it be clearer? Shouldn't it make more sense? That's where faith gets tested the most. Not in the moments when things are falling into place, but in the moments when things feel like they're falling apart. Because it's easy to believe God is working when everything is going the way you expected. But real faith is trusting that He's working even when nothing looks like what you imagined. Joseph had a dream. God showed him something so powerful, so vivid, that he couldn't keep it to himself. He believed it with everything in him. But the moment he shared it, life started moving in the opposite direction. Instead of being promoted, he was thrown into a pit. Instead of stepping into his calling, he was sold into slavery. Instead of being honored, he was falsely accused and sent to prison. If you had asked Joseph in that moment, he probably would have told you that none of this looked like the plan. He had every reason to believe that something had gone terribly wrong, that he had misheard God, that his dream had been shattered. But what Joseph couldn't see, in the prison, God had already established in the palace. Because while Joseph was questioning his circumstances, God was orchestrating something bigger. Every detour, every betrayal, every setback, it wasn't a mistake. It was a strategy. What if what you're calling a disappointment is actually a divine setup? What if the thing you're crying over, the thing you're begging God to change, is actually the thing He's using to position you for something greater? Moses was called to lead God's people out of Egypt. That was the plan. But before he ever got to the Red Sea, before he ever performed miracles, before he ever stood before Pharaoh, he had to spend 40 years in the wilderness. And if you had asked Moses during those years if he still believed in his calling, he might have struggled to see it. He might have thought he had missed his chance. But what Moses thought was wasted time was actually preparation. God was developing him in a season of obscurity so that when the moment came, he would be ready. Some of you are in that season right now. You feel like you've been forgotten. You feel like life has taken an unexpected turn, and you're trying to figure out if you're even on the right path anymore. But just because it doesn't look like the plan doesn't mean it's not part of the plan. God never promised the path would be easy. He never said it would make sense, but He did promise that He would be with you through every twist and turn, through every high and low, and He never wastes a season. What if David had given up when he was tending sheep? What if he had decided that his life would never be more than what he could see in front of him? He was anointed to be king, but before he ever wore the crown, he had to fight lions and bears. He had to be overlooked. He had to face a giant. He had to run for his life. None of that looked like part of the plan. But without the fight, he wouldn't have had the strength to carry the responsibility of being king. Without the trials, he wouldn't have had the wisdom to lead. Some of the things you're going through right now are not signs that God has abandoned you. You're in training for the thing you've been praying for. You're being shaped for the thing you've been believing for. You may not see it yet, But one day you'll look back and realize every step, every struggle, every unexpected turn, it was all part of the plan. You've been holding on to something that God already told you to let go of. You've been praying for doors to open that He's already closed. And the longer you hold on, the more frustrated you become, because deep down you know this isn't working anymore. But instead of trusting that God has something better, you're trying to force something that isn't in the plan anymore. You're trying to restore something that was never meant to go with you into your next season. It's hard to let go. It's hard when you invested time, when you poured your heart into something, when you believed with everything in you that it was supposed to last, and now you're watching it slip away. A relationship that you thought would be forever. An opportunity that you thought was the answer to your prayers. A plan that seemed so perfect until it wasn't. And now you're standing in the wreckage asking God why. But what if the reason He removed it is because He's making room for something greater? What if what you're trying so hard to hold on to is the very thing that's holding you back? When Samuel was grieving over Saul, God spoke something so powerful. He said, "How long will you mourn over what I have rejected?" In other words, why are you still crying over something that I've already moved on from? Why are you holding on to something that isn't part of your future anymore? Samuel was so focused on what was lost that he almost missed what was next. Because while he was mourning over Saul, God had already chosen David. While Samuel was looking at the past, God was preparing something greater. And the same is true for you. You've been asking God to bring something back, but what if He's already chosen something better? You've been fighting to hold on to what's comfortable, but what if He's calling you into something greater? Lot's wife made the mistake of looking back. When God was trying to bring her into a new place, she couldn't let go of the old one. She turned around longing for what was behind her, and it cost her everything. How many of us are stuck because we keep looking back? How many of us are delaying what God wants to do because we refuse to release what He's already removed? The longer you hold on to what's no longer meant for you, the more you delay stepping into what is. The longer you fight to keep something that God is trying to take away, the longer you stay stuck in a place you were never meant to stay. Sometimes we don't let go because we're afraid that if we release what's in our hands, we won't have anything left. Afraid that if we walk away from what's familiar, we'll be left empty. But God never asks you to let go of something without the intention of replacing it with something better. He never removes without restoring. He never takes away without giving more. You can't receive what He has next if your hands are still full of what's expired. Think about the disciples. When Jesus called them, He didn't give them all the details. He didn't tell them exactly where they were going or what would happen along the way. He just said, "Follow me." And in order to follow, they had to leave some things behind. Their boats, their nets, the lives they had built. It wasn't that those things were bad. It wasn't that they didn't serve a purpose for a time, but they weren't part of the next season. And if the disciples had refused to let go, they would have never stepped into their calling. What is God asking you to release? What have you been clinging to that is keeping you from moving forward? What are you still trying to resurrect when God has already called it finished? You can't walk into the new thing if you're still holding on to the old. You can't step into the future if you're still tied to the past. At some point, you have to trust that if God removed it, He has something better. If He closed the door, He has a greater one waiting. If He said no, it's because He's setting you up for the right yes. And the moment you stop fighting for what's behind you, you'll finally be free to receive what's ahead. Faith isn't just about believing for the big miracles. It's not just about standing on the mountaintop and shouting that God is good when everything in your life is working out exactly the way you planned. Faith is trusting God in the in-between. It's believing that he's still moving even when everything around you says otherwise. It's holding on to his promises when the process looks nothing like what you expected. The hardest part of faith isn't believing that God can do it. It's believing that what he's doing right now, even the painful, confusing, frustrating parts, is still working for your good. It's easy to have faith when doors are flying open, when opportunities are flowing, when prayers are being answered exactly the way you hoped. But real faith is trusting God when the answer is wait. When the door stays closed, when the situation seems to be getting worse instead of better. Abraham had a promise. God told him he would be the father of many nations. But years passed and nothing happened. No child, no sign that the promise was coming, just silence, just waiting. And somewhere in the waiting, doubt crept in. Abraham and Sarah decided to take matters into their own hands. They thought maybe God needed their help. Maybe they needed to force what he had promised. And the result was a mess they weren't prepared for. Because when you try to rush what God is doing, when you try to force something that isn't ready yet, you end up with something that wasn't meant to be. Some of you are in a season of waiting, and it's testing you in ways you never imagined. You're looking around at other people stepping into their promises, and you're wondering why yours hasn't come yet. You're fighting the temptation to make things happen in your own strength, to create your own shortcuts, to push something forward that isn't ready. But the process matters just as much as the promise. The waiting isn't wasted. God isn't withholding from you. He's preparing you. He's strengthening you so that when the blessing comes, you'll be able to sustain it. Because what good is a blessing if you're not ready to carry it? David was anointed king long before he ever wore the crown. He was chosen, he was called, and yet he spent years running for his life. He spent years serving in places that were beneath his calling. He spent years in hiding, waiting for something that he already knew was his. And he could have given up. He could have let the process make him bitter. But instead, he let it prepare him. He let the wilderness teach him what the throne never could. Some of you are in a wilderness right now. You feel forgotten. You feel like you're stuck in a place that doesn't match your calling. You feel like God has put something inside of you, but he's taken too long to bring it to pass. But what if this season isn't about what you're waiting for? What if it's about what God is doing in you while you wait? What if this season is strengthening you, stretching you, deepening your trust in him, so that when the moment comes, you'll be ready? When Jesus told Peter to step out of the boat, Peter had the faith to walk on water. But the moment he took his eyes off Jesus and looked at the wind, he started sinking. Because faith isn't just about stepping out. It's about staying focused. It's about trusting God, even when the storm is raging. It's about keeping your eyes on him, even when everything around you says you should give up. Some of you started strong. You believed God in the beginning, but then life hit you. Then things didn't go the way you thought they would, and now you're sinking under the weight of doubt, under the fear that maybe you got it wrong, that maybe you should just quit. But just because you don't see it yet doesn't mean it's not happening. Just because the process is hard doesn't mean the promise isn't coming. Just because you feel like you're sinking doesn't mean God isn't still holding you up. Faith is trusting that the same God who called you is the same God who will carry you through. That if he started it, he will finish it. That even in the waiting, even in the wilderness, even in the middle of what doesn't make sense, He is still working. You keep looking at your situation, trying to make sense of it. You keep wondering why things happened the way they did, why certain doors closed, why some relationships fell apart, why the path you thought was straight suddenly took an unexpected turn. And the more you try to figure it out, the more frustrated you become, because none of it makes sense, yet none of it looks like the vision God gave you. But what if the reason it doesn't make sense is because the story isn't finished yet? What if what looks like chaos right now is actually part of something greater? What if everything you've been through, every disappointment, every setback, every unanswered prayer is actually leading you exactly where you need to be? Joseph didn't understand it when his brothers threw him into the pit. He didn't understand it when he was sold into slavery. He didn't understand it when he was falsely accused and sent to prison. If you had asked him in that moment, he probably would have said, this can't be part of the plan. But years later, when he was standing in the palace, when he was second in command over all of Egypt, when he was in a position to save his family from famine, he looked back and saw God was in it the whole time. What didn't make sense in the moment, every struggle, every betrayal, every unexpected turn, it was all part of the process that led him to his purpose. You may not see it right now, but one day you'll look back and realize that nothing was wasted. Not the pain, not the delays, not the moments when you felt like giving up. God was using all of it because He doesn't make mistakes. He doesn't waste seasons. He doesn't allow things to happen randomly. If He let you go through it, He has a purpose for it. Think about the Israelites. God promised them the promised land, but instead of taking them straight there, He led them the long way around. He took them through the wilderness. He took them through seasons of testing. He let them face battles that seemed impossible. And they questioned Him. They doubted Him. They wondered if He had abandoned them. But what they didn't realize was that the long way was the best way. The battles were preparing them. The wilderness was shaping them. The delay wasn't a denial. It was a setup. Because when they finally stepped into the land, they weren't just stepping into a blessing. They were stepping into something they were ready to handle. Some of you are frustrated because you thought you'd be further along by now. You thought things would have worked out differently. You thought the dream would have happened sooner. But what if God is protecting you from stepping into something too soon? What if the very thing you're calling a delay is actually His grace? What if the process is the preparation? Jesus knew He was called. He knew His purpose. But before He ever stepped into ministry, He spent 30 years waiting. Before He performed miracles, before He preached to crowds, before He fulfilled His purpose, He had to wait. And then when He finally stepped into it, the first thing He faced was the wilderness. Because purpose isn't just about arriving, it's about becoming. And becoming takes time. It takes shaping. It takes walking through things you don't understand. Some of you are in a wilderness season and you're asking God, where are you? You're looking at your life and it feels like nothing is moving, nothing is changing, and you're starting to wonder if you missed it. But what if this season is part of the setup? What if the things you're facing right now are actually positioning you for what's coming next? What if the thing that looks like a dead end is actually a doorway? God is too strategic to waste a season. He's too intentional to let you go through something for no reason. If you're in it, He's using it. And one day when you look back, you'll see it every step, every struggle, every unexpected turn. It was all part of the plan. You've been standing in the middle of this season, wrestling with questions, struggling with uncertainty, wondering if this is really how things were supposed to turn out. You started with confidence. You stepped out in faith. You believed that God was leading you somewhere, that He had a purpose for you, that everything was unfolding according to His plan. But now, you're not so sure. Now it feels like you're lost in the middle of something you don't understand, walking a road that looks nothing like what you expected. And it's in moments like these that doubt creeps in. It's in moments like these that fear starts whispering, maybe I missed it. Maybe I got it wrong. Maybe I was never supposed to be here in the first place. Because when life doesn't go according to your plan, when the road takes a turn you didn't see coming, when things feel harder than you thought they would be, the natural instinct is to assume something went wrong. But what if this isn't a mistake? What if the thing that feels like a detour is actually the path? What if the challenge that's making you question everything is actually the confirmation that you're right where you need to be? Because God never promised that the journey would be smooth. He never said that the road would be easy. He never guaranteed that every step would make sense, but He did promise that He would be with you. He did promise that He was working all things together for your good. He did promise that even when it doesn't look like the plan, it's still part of the plan. Joseph had a dream. He saw the end before he ever took the first step. But God didn't show him the process. God didn't show him the pit, the betrayal, the slavery, the false accusations, the years in prison. Because if Joseph had seen all of that ahead of time, maybe he would have been too afraid to move forward. Maybe he would have doubted whether the dream was even real. And yet, even in the middle of the struggle, even in the moments that didn't make sense, God's plan was still unfolding, because what looked like setbacks were really setups. What looked like delays were really divine positioning. And the same is true for you. You may not see it now. You may be standing in the middle of the process, looking at everything that has gone wrong, wondering how any of this could possibly be part of the plan. But just because you don't see it doesn't mean God isn't in it. Just because you don't understand it doesn't mean He's not working. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness before he ever stepped into his calling. He had to go through a season of isolation before he was ready to lead. David was anointed as king, but spent years running for his life before he ever sat on the throne. The disciples had to leave behind everything they knew before they could walk in the purpose God had for them. The process is never easy. It's rarely comfortable, but it is necessary, because God is not just preparing the promise for you. He's preparing you for the promise. He's shaping you, strengthening you, teaching you how to trust Him when things don't go according to your plan. Because if you can trust Him in the struggle, you'll be able to sustain the blessing. If you can believe Him in the wilderness, you'll be ready to walk in the promise. And maybe that's what this season is really about. Maybe this isn't about whether or not God is working. Maybe this is about whether or not you will trust Him, even when you don't understand how. Because the enemy would love to convince you that this is the end. He would love to get you so focused on what hasn't happened yet, so distracted by what didn't go the way you thought it would, that you give up before you ever reach the place God is leading you to. He would love to make you believe that just because the road is hard, that means you're on the wrong one. But if the enemy is fighting you this hard, maybe it's because he knows what's ahead of you. Maybe it's because he knows that if you keep walking, if you keep trusting, if you refuse to give up, you're about to step into something greater than you ever imagined. God didn't bring you this far just to leave you. He didn't put the dream in your heart just to let it die. He didn't lead you to this place just to abandon you in the process. Every step has been intentional. Every season has been preparation. Every closed door, every painful moment, every unexpected turn, it has all been part of the story He is writing. And the author of your story does not make mistakes. You're not lost. You're not forgotten. You're not off track. You are exactly where you need to be. And even though you can't see it yet, even though it doesn't all make sense right now, God is still working. And one day you'll look back and realize that what felt like a detour was actually the road. What felt like a setback was actually the setup. What felt like the breaking point was actually the breakthrough. And when that day comes, when you finally step into the thing you've been waiting for, when you finally see the fulfillment of what God has promised, you'll understand. You'll see that every tear, every struggle, every moment of doubt, it was all part of the plan.